of this cost me around $500 and most of it was bought in the last few months. But why? Because my bases suck. I never paid enough attention to my bases because, let's face it, painting the minis is way more fun. But this changes today. So does $500 worth of hobby supplies result in better bases? Well, I don't know, you'll be the judge. Obviously, I won't use all the things I bought today, but I wanna know if I can upgrade my basing game with some of these. Right now, we'll tackle 3 different bases. A desert base for a space marine, urban rebel base for my sister of battle, and a water base for the Slenderman. Now, these 2 already have a base done, but they do deserve an upgrade. So the first thing I did is use my hobby knife to cut off the sister of battle and my primal strength to detach the space marine. It might be better to attach the miniature once the base is painted, and we'll do that for these 2, but for the Slenderman we won't. You'll understand why later. And that means we can pretty much start working on it. Because I wanna feel fancy, I'll use a spatula to spread this texture paint over the entire base. This makes it easier to load more paint onto your base, but also your brushes will get to live longer. You do have to be careful around the parts you already painted, but if you get a little bit on the feet, it's not a problem. Also, this is the Slenderman. You think he gives a shit about dirt? Now, we will get back to the Space Marine and the Sister of Battle later, but I want to describe to you what exactly is the water base gonna look like. The impression should be that he is standing in the middle of some dark forest river. And sure, we are gonna use some of the cool water effects I bought later, but to make it more credible, I wanna add some stones of multiple sizes from landscapes in detail. If you do this before the texture paint is dry, you don't even have to use any kind of glue. And by the way, if you don't want to buy stones for 13 euros, I guess you could make them out of milliput, or you could go outside, but I'm too lazy for that. This base is ready to be primed, but the other 2 are not, like at all. So looking at the urban base, I'll use bricks, some metal scrap of various sizes, and these pieces of rubble. I also bought these plastic rods in a shape of a construction beam, and oh boy, it's a pain in the dick to cut. These basing supplies, on the other hand, cost me around 50 euros. And maybe you could make them out of milliput, but you would have to be good at sculpting, which I am not. However, I still used milliput to attach all the scrap parts together. I put the construction beam in the front because I think it's interesting. Some bricks on side so the Sister of Battle can stand there, and so on and so forth. You can also see that I am trying to make everything look like it's sunk into the dirt by pushing some milliput around it. Another advantage of using milliput and not glue is that you can plan ahead the placement of your mini. For example, if you get the impression that one of the feet is levitating, just add more scrap or push the other side deeper into the milliput. This process of adding scrap around the milliput continues until you're happy with it. This is the first time I'm doing a base like this, and I might have overdone it. But again, you'll be the judge. On top of that, I use a muddy texture paint to make it textured. So I cover mostly the flat parts and milliput. And on top of that, I use a PVA glue and cover it with chunky pigment to have even more texture. And on top of that, no, that's it. That's enough texture. So the 2 bases are ready to be primed, and that leaves us with... I am using bark pieces from landscapes in detail to represent a rock. The most important thing here is just picking the right bark piece. If you think that you have the right one, dry fit your miniature to see if it works. I also realized that I didn't cut the Space Marine from the previous base, but I ripped it off. So after cleaning the feet with my hobby file, I think that it fits quite nicely. I glued the bark using 2 different types of glue, just to be sure. And once more, I applied texture paint to the flat parts around it. And now, to prime all of these bases, I am using a black primer and a regular paintbrush. Really? Yes, really. You don't always have to use a spray can or an airbrush, especially when you won't have to touch the top of the base. And additionally, if the miniature is already on the base, it gives you more control to be careful. So if anyone is telling you that you should definitely get an airbrush, yeah, they are still probably right. But everything you do with an airbrush can be done with a paintbrush, and not the other way around. But it is slower. Now that all of these bases are primed, let's go ahead and finish the desert base first. There is no secret secret formula when it comes to paint choice. The important thing here is to start with brown and build up to desaturated yellows and ochre. You can mix in some orange here and there, but what really matters is that you keep the crevices dark and make the edges lighter. Although there is no secret paint recipe, there is a secret tool that we'll use. These are dry pigments and they are your best friends when it comes to basing. In this case, stippling some ochre pigment all over the sandy parts should do the trick. But because I'm a dummy, I forgot that I want some grass tufts in there. With the help of PVA glue, they stay in place even though the dry pigment is already there. And I added some more on top. So we are pretty much done with this base, right? Think again. To fix the pigment so it stays in place, you can use an airbrush thinner. Yes. Really? So not only do I apply the thinner to the sandy parts, but before it goes dry, I also stipple some more pigment on top. That way it retains the dry look. And that's pretty much what I did on this base as well. Now when you paint the rim of the base, you can actually ruin your miniature. So before painting it black, make sure that you remove any excess pigment from the rim. But for more tips on how to paint the rim of the base correctly, you can simply look up the term rimming. You'll thank me later. And you know what? One last thing I added to make it more interesting is this little skull. There. Perfect. Aside from paints and glue, for this particular base we used a bark piece, a texture paint, some tufts, dry pigment and a skull. That makes it the easiest base but also the cheapest one. Just perfect for your army. And I think that this is what the base for my Golden Demon entry should have looked like. Before tackling the water effects, let's look at the Urban Rebel base. First, I spray a dark green-gray base coat. If you wanna be slower, use a paintbrush. When it comes to base coating all the individual scrap pieces, I'll have to use a paintbrush anyway. Bricks start off with brownish red base coat, the cogs and the small metal parts with a dark blue base coat, and even though I am painting this construction beam as green, that's gonna change later anyway. I also want the base to complement my Sister of Battle, so I make sure to include some green or mint color. As I proceed, metallic parts need some reflections, so I just picked a spot and started to build it up. For the bricks, I used more saturated brown to highlight them a little bit, and then made some scratches and edge highlights with almost like a skin tone color. Now honestly, I go back and forth between all the different colors here, but the basic principles of miniature painting still apply. But if you wanna see more of this process, the unedited footage for all three bases is on my Patreon. And just as I said, I am repainting this construction beam to be metallic. Because it's a rather simple shape, I painted some reflection in the middle and focused on highlighting the edges with a stippling motion. Once I have painted all the elements, it was yet again time for dry pigments. In this case I used a brownish one, but I should have used a blue pigment. To fix it, however, I used a different solution. This is a pigment fixer and it's specifically made for this purpose. So basically I'm showing you that you have more than one option. Additionally, I am using a pipette for this. And just like the last time, I put some pigment on top for that dry look. However, as I was painting the rim of the base, I realized that it doesn't really complement the red armor. So I added some green pigment on top. Unfortunately, I wasn't really sure if that's the right decision or not. So I added even more different pigments. And in the end, I got this. I'm not sure if you like it, but for me it's a bit too messy. It doesn't look terrible, but I think that if I used just blue pigment, it would be miles better. Let's move to... For the base coat here, I used just two colors. Dark jade color for the ground underwater and matte black for the stones. Did I say two colors? Yeah, that's just half true. Before the dark jade got dry, I mixed in some mint color around his feet, so it kinda acts like a spotlight. The beautiful thing about wet blending on such a textured surface is that you don't really have to worry about smoothness. Right after that, I started defining the stones. Again, I don't wanna bore you to death by showing you all the brush strokes, but basically I added lighter and lighter khaki color. Initially it starts with dark yellowish brown and then moves to green-gray and yellow-gray highlights. That way it looks like a mossy stone. But again, unedited footage is on my Patreon, which is also a nice way to support the channel. And now is when the magic happens. I used the unique shape of the base to wrap a masking tape around it. Now if you know what happens next, you must be like, but Zumigito, a masking tape is definitely not enough. Shh. I know what I'm doing. You might think that I am about to use a 2-part epoxy resin, right? But I am not. I use still water effects, which is fine for such a small base. It has high viscosity, so just a masking tape is enough to keep it from spilling. Resin, on the other hand, is a pain in the dick. And it's toxic. So for small bases, it's not a friendly solution. On the other hand, if you want to build up some real depth, you will still have to use it. As I pour the still water, I make sure to spread it with a cheap synthetic brush. That way it gets everywhere just like water. After waiting for a day, I removed the masking tape and the result is not bad. But I wanna go deeper, so I simply repeat the process. I am not sure how many times you can do this, but if it's more than 3 times, I am pretty sure that using epoxy resin is more convenient solution. Because I was confident that this is the final layer, I also added some red paint to represent blood, dripping from his hands. You should also try to mix it a little bit, because it's water. That's how it works. So the blood cannot stay perfectly in one place. After waiting another day, this is pretty good. But we are still not done. The edges look atrocious, so I decided to clip them off. And to fix it, I use water texture from Vallejo. This will make the edges glossy again, and if you want, you can sculpt some waves or current. Now, because this is Slenderman, I'm gonna do something special. The Slenderman got really mainstream in 2012 when the game Slenderman The 8 Pages came out. And because you have to collect the pages and run from Slenderman to win, I wanna add one of the pages. A piece of parchment paper will do the trick. It's kinda bizarre that I'm painting a parchment paper on a parchment paper, but it is what it is. After applying multiple dark green washes, it's time for a messy freehand. I don't care about precision at this point because in-game the papers don't look quite pristine either. Using PVA glue, I attached the paper to the base and I went for another round of a dark green or dark jade wash. Obviously the paper should be wet, or at least a part of it. So with my almighty spatula, I spread some water texture on top. To add even more visual interest, I sprinkled some moss on top of the dry stones. This base is the one I am the most happy with. Even though it doesn't really contrast with the miniature, it adds the necessary atmosphere. And we used around €62 worth of hobby products. And sure, all of these bases could be better, but for the most part it's an experiment for me after buying so much stuff. And these are definitely better than my older bases. So yes, buying basing materials definitely helps. What a surprise! I will be covering even more bases in the future, like I wanna do some waterfalls or cracking ice or stuff like that. So if that sounds interesting to you, you should absolutely subscribe to this channel. And see you in the next one. But for more tips on how to paint the rim of the base correctly, you can look up the term rimming. Trust me.